All right, so again, thank you everyone for coming out. Like I said, if you wanted to share where you're coming from in the chat box, as well as if you do have any questions along the way, the nice feature with virtual is that you can ask those questions without interrupting the speaker. You can't do that in real life. And of course, if you know that answer to the question, I've left them open that you feel free to answer those if you might have some information to give to others. But then we'll try to go through those questions and answer as many of them as I can towards the end. So my name is Mindy Murdock. I'm our Director of Recreation Services for Zionsville Parks and Recreation. I am also a naturalist with over 20 years experience. And on top of that, I'm kind of an avid backyard gardener. So I do not have training and certifications in gardening. Those are all in nature. This is just information that I've gathered over the years from trial and error from myself, from others. You know, my primary gardening is native plants and of course edibles that you would eat. So, you know, I can't really help with strong ornamentals, but you're on here. If you're tuning in, it's because either you already have a vegetable garden and maybe you've got some questions, or you're just thinking about starting a vegetable garden and what do you go from there? So this really is kind of from a step by step of what to think about when you're doing your vegetable gardening. So we'll get started. Oh no, come on. There we go. It's going to lag on me a little, hopefully not too much. All right, so, you know, there's many reasons on why we want to do vegetable gardening, and everybody has their kind of their own unique why. You know, some people want to do it because they want to really, you know, kind of have that sense of I'm growing my own food. I know where it's coming from. I can make sure that it's organic, try to save some cost on that one. Maybe you want to do that because you want to get into canning and preserving, which is a whole nother area and lots of information on that one. Maybe you're doing it because you want to garden as a way to attract pollinators and insects into your yard. And that's a big one, especially for people that are focusing on native plants. Maybe it's a family activity that you want to get your kids involved more outside, or maybe just get yourself involved outside more. You know, perhaps it's a way for you that you want to look at as a way to kind of do stress relief. But just as a heads up, gardening does take some effort, and there are times that it's just as stressful as everything else. But there's lots of reasons why you would want to start to look at doing your own vegetable garden. But there's really kind of some basic steps to go through to really get you to where you're actually enjoying your harvest. So we're going to walk through these everywhere from deciding what to grow, where you want to put it, how you want to plan your your garden, you know, investing in basic garden tools, testing your soil, all the way to you know, some plant care, and then enjoying your harvest. So first and foremost, you know, decide what you'd like to grow. And I have a couple rules when it comes to gardening, really anything, but especially with vegetables, is rule number one: don't grow a crop that you know you won't eat. So if you won't eat it, don't grow it. Look at your vegetable garden as really valuable real estate for yourself. So focus on the things that you know you're going to eat and you're going to love, especially things that your family really truly enjoys. Because if you're not going to eat it, you know, granted, you might find people to take it, but more than likely you're going to get tired of trying to take care of something that you're not really going to have any benefit with. The only real rule I break on this one are flowers. So edible flowers or not edible flowers, doesn't matter, but I do love to see flowers worked into any kind of vegetable garden because they really do help support pollinators as well as those beneficial insects for your garden. So they're going to help your garden out just as much as they're beautiful. So make sure when you're trying to pick, so if you're like me, right about now, I'm about every day getting more and more, and I'm not going to promote one or the other, but garden catalogs in the mail. So make sure there's a lot of really interesting ones, but a lot of those catalogs are wide ranging. So make sure that whatever you're looking at is something that is fit for your garden zone and also works with your first and last frost dates. Those are going to vary depending on, even within the zone, they're going to vary. Also think about, the size requirements for what you want to grow. So if you only want to have a small little yard garden or like a patio garden, you probably don't want to try to grow a pumpkin because it's going to take over that entire space and you may get one pumpkin out of that one. So keep that one in mind, are the sizes that these plants are going to get. Because yeah, they all start out as tiny seeds, but they're going to grow into different sizes as well. So what do I mean by gardening zones? If this is something that you've never looked at in the past, well, wherever you are, and I just pulled up the United States, hopefully everyone's from the United States. I've had ones where people are from other countries, so hopefully you can find gardening zones for yourself. But you can pull that up and you can see. So if they're Midwest, is kind of a variation between a 5 and a 6 for the most part. But this really has to deal with the temperatures that you get, your highs, your first and last frosts. But within that 6, so Indiana is mostly 6, there's going to be a pretty big variation. So another thing that you can look for is actually trying to find these growing sheets, that they put together, these planting guides that they have. And so this one, there's lots of them out there. ufseeds.com is just one that's based in our area that I pulled this one up for Indianapolis. But it kind of shows you that, and again, there's some variation to that. There's a 10% chance we might have a frost after. So, May 9th for Indianapolis, but we, of course, last year had a late frost that did a lot of damage to a lot of people's plants. So that's also something to think about. But these are nice ones because they kind of give you an idea of, if you want to try to start things indoors, when should you do that? If you want to put them outside, when do you want to get those seeds outside? And some things can start very early, and some you really want to wait till the soil has warmed up. Otherwise, they're just going to sit there and they're not going to grow. So really knowing your zone and knowing when you can or can't plant things, and that's going to help you decide what you really want to focus on planting. So then the next one is, choose your location of where you want to start your garden. And this kind of falls in not just your location, but what size of a garden do you want? And I will say for size, keep in mind manageability. Everybody wants to have a 40 by 40 garden and think that they're going to be able to grow absolutely everything they're going to eat. But more than likely, most of us do not have the time to manage a 40 by 40 garden. So think about what is truly manageable for you. Some things to think about when you're choosing your location for your garden is, first of all, most of our vegetable plants, they're going to require either full sun or at minimum of 5 hours of direct sunlight. So not like side sunlight, like towards the evening, but full on direct sunlight. If you really want to get the fruits and vegetables that's why you're growing a vegetable garden, is to actually have things you can consume and not just leafy green plants growing up. So make sure your area, it might mean that you have to go out at certain times of the day and examine a location, especially if you have a lot of shade, to find a spot that would be right for you. If you do have a lot of shade, there are some, a lot of the root vegetables, a lot of your greens are going to do very well. A lot of your herbs are going to do well in partial shade, but you're not going to get those big old juicy tomatoes that you really, really want if you have mostly shade. Another thing that people probably don't consider, is also think about where your garden is relation to what you're doing. So if your garden is way far away from your house, you're probably not going to go out there as often to pick produce, to water it, to weed it, versus if you walk out your back door and it's 10, 20 feet away. It's going to be more in your eye, and you're going to want to be out there and taking care of it more. We have community gardens here in Zionsville, and that's a big one that I see, is that people plant out their community garden, and then they try to get out there every other week, and their garden becomes overrun with weeds very quickly because it's not in their eye, they're not thinking about it. And plants are going to grow quickly when they are supposed to grow quickly, which is in the summer. Another thing when you're choosing your location for your garden is really kind of see and watch out for different things. So you want to watch out for wildlife, and you may have to plan accordingly for wildlife if you have a lot in your area. If you happen to have pets, keep in mind where they might go. You probably don't want to put your garden right in the path of where your dog loves to run and to lay and to dig, because he's going to do the same thing in your garden. And also children's play areas. Although I would suggest that potentially even putting a small garden near an area where your children play and getting them involved in almost making a children's garden for them. But yeah, I mean, definitely you don't want to put your garden in the middle of where your kids like to play soccer. They're not going to appreciate it, and neither will you. So then planning your garden. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do this one. There are many, some are paid, some are free online apps that you can do. And this is kind of a screenshot of one, if that's the route you want to go. Or you can old school it like I usually do. And that means you pull out the good old graph paper and you sit down and you draw out what you want, but really sit there and think about, how do you want to lay your garden out? What direction do you want it to face? You might have to turn it a certain way. If you're thinking about doing raised beds, how many beds and what layout do you want? Because so you want to plan it this first time so that you're not having to go back in and change it every year because it didn't work the way that you had hoped it would work. So really spend that time. Winter's a perfect time to do it while you're looking at all your garden books and plan out what you think your garden wants to look at. Another nice thing with planning out your garden is that you can do it in phases. You can say, well, this year I'm going to do this size garden, and if it goes well and I think it's manageable, this is where I'm going to add on for phase 2 for the next year. So if your goal is to get that 40 foot by 40 foot garden, doesn't mean you have to do 40 by 40 the first year. Maybe you do half of that size or a third of that size, and then grow and realize if you do need more space or you don't need more space. So planning is key. So here's some things. So yes, deciding on the type and the style. I would highly recommend that you look at planning out your garden in blocks or into actual beds instead of single rows. You can plant more plants within a block or a bed, and that also then gives you more area that you're not walking and compacting on. So fewer rows, more blocks of plants. Kind of a grid type pattern if you want to. The minimizing your walkways, because being in mind, if you're paying to put down fertilizers and then soil amendment and maybe paying someone to come out and rototill your garden area or sitting out there and working it, and then all you do is end up walking over, a quarter of what you've put all that money into, you're really wasting the money that you put into it. So kind of plan out where your walkways are going to be, and then don't put fertilizer in that spot or don't amend the soil in those areas because they're going to get compacted down. You can always work in those companion plants. So finding areas where you might want to tuck in certain herbs just for pollinators or certain flowers to attract, again, bees or other insects. And then, starting small and growing from there. So really a small, very well-tended, taken care of garden is going to produce just as much, if not more, of that huge, large garden that you let weeds take over, just because you can't take care of it. So we're going to talk about what are some different types. When we talk about gardens, not everything has to be right on bare soil and what you think of when like a farmer kind of thing. And I'm a farm kid, so I can say that one. There are many different ways to do this one. One, a very common one for people are raised beds. This is what we actually have in our house, and we've tried multiple different ways, and raised beds seem to work the best for us. The nice thing with raised beds is that you're not walking into that dirt. So when you prep it once, you don't have to really sit there and hoe it and turn it over and move it as much as if you had a large garden and you're walking through it and then you're compacting the soil. But you still want some things to think about. So first of all, none of your raised beds should be wider than 4 foot. So 3 to 4 feet is really as wide as you want to put them across. So that means that from either end of your bed, you should be able to reach the center. That's going to keep you out of that bed. You don't want to be stepping in that bed. The other thing to think about is most raised beds are roughly about 8 feet long. You can do them longer. You know, I don't think you're going to be walking towards that way, but you might. The nice thing with 8 feet is that most people can find a way to get an 8-foot board home, even if they have a car, versus if you're trying to build a 16 or a 12 or some other size dimension lumber. So, 4 foot by 8 is kind of the traditional, or I've seen 4 by 4 kind of garden bed for a raised bed. If you're thinking about depth, you want to do a minimum of 6 inches. That's going to allow room for those roots and have plenty of area for amended soil. The deeper you go is great if you're talking root vegetables like carrots, but also keep in mind that also means that's going to increase your cost, because the reason you're going for a raised bed is that you want to add in soil. You're not using the soil you already have. And that soil, what is it? Well, you definitely just don't want to go and get just a, pile of dirt that you got for free from so-and-so because they were building their house. You want to kind of do a mixture of, usually raised beds are a mixture of a topsoil or a really kind of loose garden soil, some peat, vermiculite for helping with water retention for those two, and then some good quality compost, whether it's compost that you've actually created or mixed in, or it's compost that you've purchased. But you really want to kind of have that nice mix so that your soil is nice and loose and can hold moisture, and it's going to allow those plants to grow very quickly versus like the heavy clay that we have here in Indiana. Another one that you can always look at are container gardens. So maybe you don't have the space to do raised beds or a traditional type of bed. You can always look at containers. So maybe you're in a condo and you only have a patio, or you're in an apartment. Still means that you can still vegetable garden. You just have to be a little resourceful. So even with limited space, one thing you can look at is they have really kind of cool grow bags that you can, I've even seen them where they can mount them on a fence or mount them on the side of your house. Just be careful with that one, that they're not holding moisture against your house. Looking at self-watering containers, or at least plastic containers, and then watering them very well so that they're not drying out. This is one area where, I love a good terracotta pot, but you really don't want to use terracotta when we're talking about your vegetables. Because the problem with terracotta is that it breathes and it's going to dry out very quickly, especially in the summer. So if you're using terracotta, although it's a natural material, you can get it glazed, or you're just going to have to make sure that either you have some sort of self-watering for it, or you're watering it 2 or 3 times a day. When you're looking at all of your seeds and your catalogs, and they do pretty well about explaining if they are, you want to look for varieties that are really container friendly. Some things it doesn't matter, things like greens, they do very well. But if we're talking stuff like tomatoes, squashes, they do have varieties that are compact, and so they're able to be used in a container. So they don't take over your limited space that you do have. But regardless of what kind of containers you use, just be in mind that a container garden, you're going to need to water a lot more than you would any of the other garden options. And then there's some other varieties out there. There is, if anyone's ever seen the book Square Foot Gardening, there's the kind of the style where you actually do you break your garden bed into squares and you plant by those squares. There's also vertical gardening, and this is where you're growing things vertically. So you can squeeze more crops in by using things like trellises to grow up. So this is another great option that if you're limited on space and maybe you've got a really narrow but long space, is actually doing trellising. So if it's like the side of a garage, you can trellis up the side of that garage if you want to grow things like tomatoes, and then you have space in front of them to put some of your other vegetables. So in our garden, I usually trellis most of my vining plants. So my tomatoes, my pole beans, my peas, my cucumbers. This last year, we actually trellised butternut squash, and it worked very well for those. So you can kind of do a mix. It's not like, well, I want to do this and that's what you have to stick to. You can do a variety. So we've got raised garden beds, and we do a mixture of vertical gardening and square foot gardening in my own home. And then there's that companion planting. So if you hear this one, and there's lots of different graphics you can look for, there's lots of different books on the matter of companion planting. But the overall idea of it is pretty simple. It's looking at vegetables and fruits sometimes that really, they interact well together. And there's two different reasons why they might interact well. One is they can work with each other. So if you think about the kind of the name all companion planting of the Three Sisters garden, and that's where you would grow corn. And then growing up that corn is where you would do your beans, because then they can use the corn as a trellis to grow up. And then underneath that is where you would put a squash plant, because those larger leaves of that squash would then help hold in the moisture around the base, as well as helping prevent weeds. So, you know, Three Sisters garden is a fantastic companion planting kind of mix. Another idea for companion planting is putting plants next to each other that are going to help each other. Whereas maybe one is very needs a lot of nutrients, so will kind of deplete your soil quickly. The other plant may actually add nutrients back into that soil. So that's another thought with Three Sisters, is that your corn is going to demolish your soil content very fast. You need a lot of fertilizer when you are dealing with corn. But things like the legumes, they're going to actually add back in some of that nitrogen. So they're going to help that corn out, and they're also going to help out your soil so it's not depleting it as quickly. Another one I've seen is where they would plant things next to a lot of flowers, especially like nasturtiums and things of that sort, where you might have an insect that would eat your particular vegetable, and then if you plant a companion plant next to it, it gives it another option. So a lot of times you can kind of draw away some of those pests by doing some companion planting. So that is kind of what it is just kind of thinking about what you're planting next to what, and some things work really well together, and some things maybe planted by somebody else. Putting all of your things that a pest will consume all in one spot doesn't help if you actually get that pest, because then they'll kind of go through the entire mix of them. So this is actually a picture of, and this was on the webinar registration, but my garden from last year. So this was taken early in the spring. So you can see I kind of pulled out my garden. We've had it for a couple of years like that, so we didn't have anything new to add. But I pulled out my, my sheet there, and I sat and decided, what we like to eat, what we don't like to eat, kind of filled it out. And you see, if you're looking at my grid there, is we do square foot. So you can see things are broken up into square feet. And so that's how we would start. But then we also have the trellises. And so we would have things growing up that trellis. And you can even see in the picture where I've taken twine and actually kind of laid out that grid. Mainly, we didn't keep the grid. We pulled it after things started to grow, but mainly so that we kind of had an idea, so that when we grew a lot of our spinach and lettuce, that we made sure they stayed in their little blocks. And then once they started to grow, the nice thing with twine is it kind of disintegrates on its own. So by the end of summer, it's fallen apart for the most anyhow. So that's kind of my background, my backyard layout. And then this was June. Another picture of kind of see how things have actually grown up. So the nice thing again with having those raised beds is, we can put them right where the grass is, and we're not having to worry about grass infiltrating in. And doing the square foot can really pack in. If you look at the one off to the right there, you can see all the lettuces, and I think at that time my spinach had bolted. But you can see you can really pack them in. The broccoli, they got a lot bigger than that one. And it really prevents any kind of weeds from growing up. So it's a method we like to use because it doesn't take up a lot of space and it's easy enough for us. And then we have walking paths that are grass, so we don't have to worry about anything. And usually by the end of summer, the squash plants and things have grown up enough that we can't even get in there to mow the grass. Kind of becomes like a little bit of a jungle, but it's fun. So moving on, so we've got our garden, we got it planned out, now we're ready. Okay, now we actually need to be prepared and ready for when it's time to plant. So we're going to talk more about soil and tools and actually purchasing plants themselves. So you're going to want to invest in some garden tools if you've never gardened before in any capacity. And there are some basic equipment that you're going to need, regardless of if you're doing a traditional garden or a square foot garden. Probably not so many of these if you're doing container gardening. But one is a good quality garden hoe. It's a good one even if you have raised beds. When you add in that compost or amend that soil, you need something to actually dig it in. So a good garden hoe is one. A stirrup hoe, and that's what the picture is. I've heard them called so many different things, but this is a great one because it just kind of knocks off once those little seeds start to grow from the weeds. You can just kind of knock them off really quickly. Rakes, both for just regular dirt rake, again, to help move in that compost and those other fertilizers, but then also a leaf rake, so clean up towards the end of the year. A nice shovel, you need to have one. And then of course your hand tools. And this, I would say even for container gardening, hand tools are a necessity. And I would highly recommend that you take some time and find some good quality hand tools, not the little cheap plastic ones, but ones that just feel right for you, and maintain those. So quality hand tools that you can use year after year, because they're really going to do, you spend the money up front and you're going to have them for a decade or more. But some nice quality hand tools that feel good to you and you like them. And then your soil. So really understanding what is going on with your soil. If you're not adding soil, if you're trying to use what you have. So do you have, where you live, do you have sandy soil? Do you have silt soil? Do you have clay? Here in central Indiana, you don't have to go too far until you start hitting really thick clay. Sorry, are there lots of rocks in your soil? That makes it a little challenging. Is it kind of a mishmash of all four? Do you live in a subdivision that was recently planted? So you probably don't have any topsoil because they kind of scraped it off as they were building the homes. And so you're starting from scratch. Another thing to think about is, the history of your location, if there's things nearby that might cause some contamination. So if you are really close to old roadways, old construction type sites, things like lead, if you're right next to the garage and the husband likes to do oil changes and isn't always the best about making sure he disposes of things properly, there's always that contamination issue of concern of, do you have gasoline or oil that might be in that soil? And then the other one is, what kind of nutrients are already in your soil? Why just go out and buy fertilizers if you really don't need to add anything if you have a good quality soil? So I always recommend, especially just starting out, is to get a test on your soil. There are home tests that you can do, or you can always look at your soil and water conservation districts, or 4-H is a lot of times as well, or even your master gardeners if you have a master gardener group. that they might be able to recommend to you, or they might actually do soil testing. Your extension office is another one. So you can get a good quality test, spend that little bit of money and find out what is actually in your soil, if it's safe to actually grow in, and then also what nutrients. So then you realize that, hey, I need to add phosphorus, or I need to add in lime or calcium or whatever it may be before you start planting. So you can amend that soil in the spring before you put any seeds or plants in the ground. And so, you know, how do you kind of build your soil? So here's some thoughts for you. If you're starting with sod, so again, if you're truly starting from scratch and you want to put your garden right where your grass is growing, right now is actually a great time to actually start what they call turn over the soil. So what you would do is that you're going to cut that sod, and you can either till it in and then cover it, or you can cut it and flip it over and then put a cover on it. But you're going to want to start to break down that grass. The nice thing with that is that's a natural compost that you're going to add in. If you're looking at doing raised beds, then it's as simple as putting down cardboard or even a few layers of newspaper over that grass and then building your bed on top of it. So you don't even have to dig into the soil. You're putting the bed right on top of your grass that you have. Again, most of your garden plants are going to want that fertile, rich, loose soil. So spending that time and kind of making it right now is going to help your plants in the future. So. And then we get to the thing. So we've got our soil, we've got our tools, we know what we want to plant. So now it's time to the fun part, right? Of actually choosing the right seeds or choosing the right plants. So I know a lot of people, and I'm not going to get into it because I've never had luck in that regard. I know a lot of people love to start their own seed indoors. It's a great thing to do. There's just a few things that you want to kind of consider and keep in mind is that you are going to have to invest in some materials if you do want to grow seed indoors. You're going to want to, of course, get some grow lights, because the biggest issue I've seen with seeds started indoors is they become very leggy as they're trying to reach for light. So you want to invest in grow lights if you're going to start seed inside so that they're getting enough UV to actually grow. Another thing as those little plants start to grow is you want to have movement, because think about outside. When they're outside, it's not perfectly still. There's going to be breezes, there's going to be wind. So you're going to want to find a way to kind of mimic that wind that they would experience. This is another reason why they get really leggy, is because there's nothing kind of helping them build up those stems. So I've seen where people will put them, if it's close enough in the spring and it's a nice day, they'll open the window and allow breeze to come through. I've seen where people have used small fans that they put on a low, so that's kind of a steady breeze. You know, but you'll need something to kind of keep them moving. And the other thing is that you're going to need to make sure that you fertilize them properly so that they don't yellow. So a lot of fertilization that is needed as those little seeds start to grow. And then also making sure that you don't start your seed too early, because the worst thing to have is have plants ready to transplant outside, but it's too early in the season to actually do it, or you don't have your garden ready yet. And now what do you do with your plants? So, so that's one thing to think about. When you're choosing your seeds, kind of take a look and make sure that none of your seeds have been treated with pesticides. They will. So you want to check on that and make sure that they haven't. The biggest one is the neonicotinoid pesticides, because they will actually stay within that plant. And while yes, they will help against any kind of pests, they'll also make sure that they help against any kind of pollinators. So when those pollinators visit those plants that have been grown with seed that's been treated, it's a death sentence for them. They'll pollinate your plant, then they'll move on, and in a short period of time, they will actually die. So I highly recommend do not purchase seed that has been treated, or even plants, if you can, that have been treated with those pesticides. If it's a quality garden center that doing what they shouldn't have to use pesticides to begin with. Good organic fertilizers, and then just, taking care of those plants. If you're looking at purchasing plants, a few things to do is, for one, is you want to look for plants that are roughly equal to the size of the pot that they're growing into, right? So if they're in a very small, what we call plug, you don't want a tomato plant that's already like 2 feet tall, because what that's going to mean is that that plant is root bound, that those roots, that plant's gotten way too big for its pot. Those roots have wrapped around over and over and over again. And, when you pull that plant out and you put it in the garden, it's going to go through shock, because you're going to have to break up those roots. You're going to have to dig it in, and then it's got to recover from that shock. And so by the time it finally recovers and begins to grow, if you would have found a smaller tomato plant, more in equal size to the pot it was growing in, and didn't have to do any damage to his roots, he wasn't root bound, put him straight into the ground, he's going to be just as big as that huge one that you thought, I'm going to get a jump on this and get the biggest plant I can, because he didn't go through the shock that other plant did. Another thing to look for when you're picking out your plants at a garden center is to look for any signs of stress on that plant. So a lot of that is discolored leaves. Or any signs of insects on that plant. So any chewed leaves or cut leaves or things of that sort, because that's the last thing you want to add in, is any kind of damage or any kind of diseases or any kind of pests that you don't already have. And a lot of times also yellowing and discoloration can be signs of mildew. It can also be signs of overwatering. So you might have some rotted roots if they've been overwatered. And again, it's going to take time for those plants to recover. And you don't want to add stuff to your garden if you can help it. So kind of be picky when you're going through there. I know you want to get your certain seeds or plants that you're looking for. But if it was a variety you really wanted and all the plants look just really root bound or really sickly, try something else. The garden center might be able to help you out with something that's comparable. And then planting with care. So this kind of goes with your planting more for your seed packets than anything else. And I'm going to say it, read your seed packets and plant your seeds according to the direction on the packet. So if they tell you to plant it at a certain depth, make sure you're planting those seeds at that particular depth, just because that's the depth that's going to have the most germination for them. For most of your transplant plants that you're buying, whatever depth they were growing in that pot, that is the depth that you want to plant them. Just so that you don't rot out the stem. The exception that I do, and I think most people do, are tomatoes, which you can actually bury for the most part up to the top leaves. So the deeper you plant a tomato, or I've seen where people will make a trench and they kind of plant them sideways with just a little bit sticking up, that's going to allow that stem of that tomato is then going to form a lot of roots, and actually becomes an extension of the roots. So your tomatoes are going to grow with even deeper roots, so that when you get those really late summer droughts, they're not going to feel that issue the same as if you just planted them normally. So, and then probably the hardest thing, and like I said, we all suffered from this last year because it got really hot. We all thought, hey, spring's here early, and then we got a week of freeze. So really and truly, watch those first and last dates. So that danger of frost, wait till the end, till it's completely gone, especially for those plants that are heat loving. They really aren't going to start growing until that temperature of that soil and the ambient air are at a certain level. So even if trying to get them in the ground early, even though you're like, yes, I got my garden planted, they're just going to sit there because they need that heat. They're heat-loving plants. So really watch your frost dates. Don't get too anxious. Don't put something in the ground just because you think you can put it in the ground, because it might not be the right time to do that one. So, and then the other one is that, thinking about hardening off your plants and any kind of protection that they might need. So if you're starting your seed from inside, when you're ready to put your plants in the garden, make sure you give them a period of time that we call what they call hardening off. And that's usually putting them out for periods of time outside, leaving them maybe overnight against the house. They have some protection. Don't just take them from your nice, warm, climate controlled home and stick them directly into your garden in the spring, because you're going to put them through shock and you may actually kill them. The other big difference is going from a grow light inside to outside in May in full on sunshine. You can scald the plants as well. So starting them outside with maybe some partial shade and working them up to experiencing what it really means to have true sunlight and not a UV light to experience. And then nurture your garden. So my second rule is grow what you love is rule number one. Make sure you're growing what you love and don't add extra things in there that you're not going to actually consume or enjoy. And the second one is that really the best fertilizer for your garden is your shadow, you out there checking it out. And it's the best for you as well. If you really want to reap the benefits of a garden, is spending that time outside with your garden. So if you're not prepared to make time in your schedule to tend, maybe instead you just hang out at the farmers markets that they're there. Or again, start small and you can always grow. The nice thing with being out there in your garden, you're gonna be able to get those weeds while they're very small still. You're also going to be able to make sure that you're watering your garden the way it should be. So most plants are going to need about an inch of water a week during its growing season. So if you're not getting rain in your area, you're going to need to water your garden. And of course, if you've got container gardens, you're going to need to water gardens a lot. But also, if you're out there watching it, overwatering is just as bad. So making sure that your soil is not too wet. So, self-waters are fun, but there are times that maybe you want to turn that off. So again, you're not causing your seeds or your roots to rot. And then the other thing is that, when you're out there, you're going to be able to notice if you've got any pest issues, right? So not always, but most of our bugs and pests are going to be kind of more attracted to a plant that might be stressed out. And then again, once they find your garden, if they have similar plants, they're going to pick through one to the other. So watching your garden, being out there, it's probably when you're more likely going to catch a pest very quickly, and then you can treat it very, as soon as you find it, versus waiting till it's an extreme issue and then you've lost half of your plants. So be your garden's best friend and be the shadow that it needs. And then lastly, hopefully you get to this point and you can actually enjoy your harvest, right? So we're now in the if it's spring and like things like spinach and lettuce, you can start pretty early, but height of summer that you're out there and actually enjoying what you have. So some things to think about for most of our plants is as soon as they start to sprout and to mature, you want to make sure that you start harvesting them, because a lot of them, the more you harvest, the more they're going to produce for you. So a lot of your leafy greens, like your lettuces, your spinaches, it's one of those where you can cut it and it grows back. So the more that you cut your lettuces and your spinach, to a point, you can cut too much, but the more you harvest, the more you're going to get before it bolts from the heat. It's going to bolt from the heat sooner or later. So why not enjoy them while they're there? For beans and peas, make sure you're trying to get out there and pick your new harvest every 2 or 3 days. And that's going to allow them to continue to grow, unless you're wanting to harvest seed and then you actually want to stop picking and you're going to wait until those pods dry on the vine before you collect them. And then if you're trying to do sweet corn, you're going to want to make sure when the cobs are nice and filled out and that silk that's on the top of that cob is pure dark. As far as when to pick, the biggest one is, you want to wait till after the dew has kind of cleared off of your plants. If you get a dewy morning, just because having that dew and you moving through your garden, you can actually transport diseases from one to the other. So wait till that burns off and harvest in the morning before you get that full on afternoon heat. You'll get the best flavor. But then, overall gardening it's good for your health. It can help fight depression. It reduces stress, and you can improve your diet while you're doing it. So, and maybe you'll find some new things that you've never ate before that you like. So I'm going to open up, I think I have one. If anyone has any questions and they want to pop them in the Q&A, and we'll answer a few of those. But it looks like we'll probably get out of here within an hour. So hopefully within your guys' lunch break, if that worked. So one question we have here is, have helpful tips for trellis gardening. Does the shape of the trellis matter for different plants? What's the best way to secure to the trellis? It really depends what you're trying to grow. I know you can buy trellises. I've seen where they have cucumber trellises and pea trellises. You can spend the money and time and do those. A lot of people will do cattle panels that they will grow and trellis off of. I have done kind of the 2x3 metal, like chicken wire type trellises, not the little hexagonal ones, but the actual 2x3 squares. In my last, let's see if let me go back. In my current garden, we are actually using like the 2x2 plastic trellising. And it's been up for 2 years and it's still holding up very well. It can't rust because it's plastic, but it hasn't started to disintegrate with the UV. So that's what we're currently using. As far as what do you do with them? For me, what I do with my green beans and my tomatoes and peas and things is because I'm out there quite a bit, and this is, again, what is your time for it, is I actually weave as they grow very carefully, kind of train them up through. And then once they kind of, especially green beans, once you get one or two or peas up there, they grab each other and off they go on that one. So I sit and weave. I know people that have used like the Chanel kind of pipe cleaner stems and very carefully twisted, not tightly, those on for their tomatoes, just so it doesn't like break the stem itself. So that's another way to secure them in. I wouldn't use anything hard like a zip tie. You want something that's going to be soft. I think they even sell soft tomato for people that do like on poles for their tomato that you can tie them up with as well. If you're going to do trellising and you're going to do something really large like squash, I've seen people that trellis watermelons. I don't know how they do it. You're going to want to make a cradle that can actually hold that fruit as it ripens, because it's going to get to the point where it's too big and it's going to pull off of the plant itself or take part of your plant down with it. So if you're going to be growing something up a trellis that's really heavy, we're not talking a cucumber, we're talking something more of the melon size, you're going to want to make some type of just kind of a cradle to hold it. And they sell them as well. They sell everything for gardening. So what does 1 inch of water per week actually look like? Well, it just depends on yours. The key, I would say, is more of use the finger test and poke in. And if you're getting soil at least a good fingertip down and it's wet, then you don't need to add any more. Just because the top might look dry, if it's wet down below, your garden is good. If you're poking down through and you're not finding really a lot of moisture, then you want to like give it a nice, good, deep drink. So not just, wetting down the dust on the top, but actually letting it soak into all of the things. Someone goes, we have lots of wildlife, squirrels, rabbits, groundhogs, chipmunks. They seem to eat off my plants before they have a chance to grow. What's recommended? Fencing. It's also great for puppies. If you noticed my garden, let me go a couple more back. There we go. The white PVC that you see, those are little just PVC pipe that we've popped up. And then we got like the plastic hardware cloth that you can kind of see on the base there. And we wrapped them in hardware cloth. Not so much, although we do have rabbit issues in my backyard. It was to keep the puppy out of the garden because he thought it was a fun place to play. How do you stop a puppy from playing in dirt? So I would say fencing, that, you know, making sure that you have it set up in a way that you can fence off those plants that you don't want to have eaten. Clutches are another. Those are kind of where you can use, I've seen where people have used like lampshades and they've wrapped them in chicken wire and put over certain plants. But yeah, you're really going to want to fence them off. You can try, there's different varieties of deterrents, like granules, fox granules, things of that sort that have a smell to help keep things at bay. But if you truly have a lot of issues with those, you know, I hate to say it, but maybe look at another location for your garden. Or I've had where people actually plant a small area of a garden just for the wildlife to kind of keep them out of yours. Yes, that is my little compost. No, we do not get an odor because we do not compost our kitchen scraps. So that compost is only for the actual gardening scraps. So if I am out, you know, deadheading and weeding plants or things of that sort, it goes into there. As you know, my spinach bolted, I went ahead and pulled the spinach and actually put that in there as well. So that compost we only use for our vegetables and garden scraps, not from kitchen scraps. So when you're getting into kitchen scraps, that's where you're going to want to probably have more of an enclosed, and you're going to want to make sure you're turning it pretty regularly to keep out. And even then you shouldn't get a smell. Really, because you're not going to want to compost anything that's going to have any kind of food product. So no cheeses, no meat products or anything of that. So that smell is going to be very minimal. Eggs, you can rinse out your eggshells and compost those. And I would actually say that's a fantastic one for tomatoes. So as you're prepping your garden, go out where you're going to plant your tomatoes. So I think our tomatoes are going to go on the kind of tall arbor this year because they've been, we also rotate to help keep out pests. So I will go out this spring when I'm laying out some new compost and some new soils, and I will dig in crushed up eggshells into those areas because they'll slowly leach out calcium. And calcium is something that tomatoes thrive for. And it'll actually help with things like blossom end rot. Calcium and also your watering is what's going to be the big issues for blossom end rot with your tomatoes. So any other questions from anybody? I think I answered them all. Oh, here's one more. Do you recommend a certain catalog or a website for ordering seeds? I don't. It's really a personal preference, and I've heard from everybody. I've tried many different ones over the years. It's usually I come down to if there's a particular variety of something I want, who has it. I also look at, what are their practices for their seeds. If they're treating their packets with insecticides, then, I don't order from them. If they're, so you can kind of do a little bit of research on the actual companies themselves and how they take care of their product that they're providing for you. But no, I don't have a real particular one. You can also look around for your local gardens. There's a lot of local garden centers that can do a very fantastic job of making sure that they can get you some quality seed that hasn't been treated. If you're really into doing organic, They're also, especially those mom and pop garden centers, they're usually great ones if you have questions, that if you come into problems with your garden as far as a certain pest, versus if you tried to go like a big box store, they're not really going to know. But yeah, so if you have a local garden center that you can ask and pose questions to, sometimes it's nice to be able to help out the locals near you. So, all right, so really enjoy more information on square foot gardening. If I consider a presentation, I could, but it's not my idea. I highly recommend, if you haven't, the square foot gardening that's with Mel Bartholomew kind of came up with really and it details everything from how many plants you want to put for whatever particular thing you're trying to grow in that square. They call it a Mel's mix for as far as with your raised beds. I did a little bit of a variation because Mel's mix is actually a little expensive. So I did a little bit of a variation to that one for our garden soil. So we weren't spending an arm and a leg just to get started. But it's a fantastic book. It's easy to read through. Like I said, lots of nice charts of, hey, I want to grow carrots. How many seeds or how many things do I put in for each square? And then just kind of trial and error and find out what works best for you. Like I said, we do square foot and trellising and companion planting. We mix in a lot of different pollinator plants in there, like zinnias and nasturtiums and things, really so that it's pleasing to the eye. We get a lot of birds and butterflies and hummingbirds that come through our garden. So it's a nice mix to have and all of that. Let's see, one more question popped up. What mix did I use? Oh, I used Mel's mix for the most part. So I did a mixture of, for my garden, and you can go into the book and you can look at the ratios that they do. But we did a mixture of peat. The nice thing with, you can buy big blocks of peat and it's not that expensive. We did a vermiculite, a good quality compost. That's probably the biggest one to make sure you have in there to get things going, versus adding in like, granulated fertilizers and anything like that, using compost. And then instead of using, like I said, I think his is mainly those three. We kind of cut back on the compost and the peat and vermiculite and added in, we got a quality garden soil mix from the big boxes. We went to a big box, but got the big quality garden soil mix just so that we had that one. And then we also went and, because we were putting in a lot of flower beds and things around our yard at the same time, that in our raised beds, the bottom probably 4 inches or so is actually soil. When we cut the sod to put in flower beds, flipped over. And so as that, and it broke down within a year, like, because we dug in to see, and it had really broken down and just added to that one. Of course, we tested our soil to make sure we didn't have any issues before we threw that soil in there. But it really did kind of help that instead of, our boards are 12 foot instead of or 12 inches, instead of trying to fill a foot deep of raised beds, we only had to fill 6 to 8 inches of soil for those. And that soil will kind of compress down. And so you'll want to top it off every year with a couple extra bags of potting soil, maybe mixed in with some peat, and kind of just blend that into there to add a little bit more nutrients that your plants might have used up. It's also a good time that if you have some compost like we do, you can actually mix in your own compost as well. So. All right. Well, that looks like I answered everyone's questions. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. If you happen to have any questions that pop up, you can always reach out to Zionsville Parks and Recreation Department and be happy to answer, or at least provide you, kind of links to get some more information. But I hope this gets you your ideas started on potentially starting your own vegetable garden, or if you already do have a vegetable garden, maybe giving you some things to think about that you want to integrate into your current garden that you have. Hope everyone has a great afternoon, and we'll see you around. Bye.